The book of Genesis, chapter 26, and we'll be looking at verses 1 through 25 today. So we won't be taking the entire chapter, although there's only a few more verses after that, so it will be too much of a problem for you to continue on reading at your own convenience. But for now, Genesis chapter 26, verses 1 through 25. Now there was a famine in the land, beside the former famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to King Abimelech of the Philistines. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt and settle in the land that I shall show you. Reside in this land as an alien, and I will be with you. I will bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands. I will fulfill the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands. And all the lands and all the nations of the earth shall gain blessing for themselves through your offspring. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my law. So Isaac settled in Gerar. When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister." For he was afraid to say, "My wife," thinking, or else the men of this place might kill me for the sake of Rebekah, because she is attractive in appearance. When Isaac had been there a long time, King Abimelech of the Philistines looked out of the window and saw him showing endearment to his wife, Rebekah. So Abimelech called for Isaac and said, "So she is your wife. Why did you then say she is my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Because I thought that I might die because of her." Abimelech said, "What is this that you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife and would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, "Whoever touches this man or his wife shall be put to death." Isaac sowed seed in that land, and in the same year he reaped 100-fold. The Lord blessed him. The man became rich, and he prospered more and more until he became very wealthy. And he had possessions, a flock and herd, and a great household, so that the Philistines envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped up and filled with earth all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of his father Abraham. And Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us. You have become too powerful for us." So Isaac departed from there and camped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham, and he gave them the names that his father had given them. But when Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found that there was a well of spring water, the herders of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herders and said, "The water is ours." So he called the well Esek, because they contended with him. Then he dug another well, and they quarreled over that one also. So he called it Sithna, and moved from there and dug another well. And they did not quarrel over it. So he called it Rehoboth, saying, "Now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land." From there, he went up to Beersheba, and that very night the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid. I am with you. I will bless you and make your offspring numerous as for my servant Abraham's sake." So he built an altar there, called on the name of the Lord, and pitched a tent there. And there Isaac's servants dug a well. So if this passage sounds familiar to you, it's probably because you were awake when we talked about these passages earlier on in the series. Because in fact, this is now the third time that this scenario is playing itself out. The first two times happen to be with Abraham. And the first one occurs in Genesis chapter 12. At that point in time, Abraham was on his way and lands in Egypt. And the second time happens to be the same place that we now find Isaac, which is in Gerar of Philistia, or the place where the Philistines dwelt, or as some scholars think, the place that the Philistines would eventually inhabit. And that happens in Genesis chapter 20. This fact that there are three occurrences of almost the same identical storyline has caused a lot of questions to arise from many scholars. There are many different ways in which we can understand how this happens. One way requires us to understand the very natural nature of how these stories came into the form that we now have them. There would have been a point in time in the history of humanity where these stories were told to one another orally. There wouldn't have been a written language. And so these stories would have been spoken from one generation to the next. And at some point in time, when there is time to pen things down and you're not busy fighting one another, the stories would be written down. But over the course of many generations, as these stories are passed on, there might be a tendency for some stories to be duplicated and for small nuances of them to be altered. And perhaps at some point in time, when it came time to pen down these stories, the community or the author realized, for example, that there are many stories like this. How do I pick and choose? Let's just include them all. And so we have obviously three very similar passages that nonetheless are intentionally kept within the Bible. The idea that Moses would have gotten all of these stories out of the blue and then immediately penned them down, that's not at all how it would have happened. And you'd be very hard pressed to find any serious biblical scholar who believes that's how it happened. If this is the case, or we could say, in spite of this being the case, how does it help us to understand the authority of the Bible? If it's true that parts of it are duplicated or that parts may have been altered, does that in any way affect the way in which we take the Bible to be the authoritative Word of God? And the answer is no. The Bible remains the authoritative Word of God. This only further shows how God either is in control and uses the human nature to weave together his perfect story, or it could show that humanity has this recurring problem and this event would have happened three times, for which is the reason why it would be recorded. So regardless of whether we believe that this story happened three times exactly like it happened, or if there are three similar stories that then the narratives over the course of time kind of got merged together and then all three of them were penned down. No matter what, there are a group of scholars, and I think I side with them on this. The point is, the form of the Bible that we have now records each of these narratives separately and very strategically at different points within the storyline of the Bible. There is an entire field of biblical study that is called canonical criticism that says, let's take the word and the format and the order of the Bible as it is, and let's figure out, even if there are interesting reasons for why it came to be that way, we believe that God is nonetheless the one who brings together the Bible, and he must have had some intention for why we are reading this now for the third time. So let's try and figure out, what is it about the third time around when we read this passage that we are to learn from and gain some new insights from? So let's start with the repetition, at least. There's a famine. And he makes it clear that this is a famine not like, or not the same one that happened earlier, which gives us the clear idea that at least this was a real event that happened the third time, which is good. Typically droughts happen, and when a drought happens, you are unable to make food, you're unable to have resources for your sheep or for your herd, and if there's no resources, if there's no food, that's what we call a famine. And this happens many times in the history of the world. It happens even once more, very significantly, when we get to, hopefully, when we get to our series as we conclude Genesis. We know that there's one more famine left. When a famine happens, there's obviously one thing that you shouldn't do, and that is nothing. When a famine happens, you should not do nothing, because if you do nothing, you are going to die. If you do nothing, you are not going to have the resources you need in order to live. So you ought to do something. So what's the something that you do during a time of famine? You move to where the resources are. It makes so much sense. It's common sense to move towards where there is plenty. It seems that as Isaac is leaving from one place looking for resources in another place, he reaches Gerar, and at this point, God tells him, don't go down to Egypt. So the clear indication is that Isaac had an intention of going down to Egypt. Why Egypt? Why is it that everyone runs there during times of famine? Well, because there's a river there. You have the river Nile that is always flowing. It is a massive river. And from that river, you're able to irrigate the crops. And if you have crops, you're able to feed your herd. And if you're able to feed your herd, well, then now you can have your lamb curry and you can have meat. And that's what it's all about, isn't it? Of course, you also eat vegetables too, but of course, I think people would, of course, prefer one over the other if they're anything like me. But if this is the case, if Egypt is such a wonderful place to be because it has natural water there, why would God tell him not to go to the one place that makes the most sense to go in a time of famine? And instead he says, stay here in this place. And this place, by the way, happens to be part of the promised land, because he says to Isaac, the place that you're in now, you're going to reside as an alien, but I will give it to your descendants as part of the promised land. So even though this is part of the area of where the Philistines would be, and we normally think of Israel as a separate nation from Philistia, this was also still part of the promised land that God had intended for them to have. But this land has a very interesting aspect to it. It's not very good when it comes to abundance of water. So you have, the Dead Sea, which is obviously undrinkable water because it's extremely salty. You have the River Jordan, which is good, and then you have the Sea of Galilee towards the northern part of Israel. But those waters depend upon the annual rains that you get. And so you could not be sure all the time that there would be that water. And besides, most of this Old Testament story, at least so far, is happening in the southern part of Israel, where there's an interesting bit of insight that we get into why it makes sense that God says, don't go to the one place that will be the best place to go if you're in a time of famine. If you read in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 10 through 14, it makes it very clear that there is another angle that God has in mind here. So I'll read that for you. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 10 to 14. For the land that you are about to enter to occupy is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you sow your seed and irrigate by foot and like a vegetable garden. But the land that you are crossing over to occupy is a land of hills and valleys, watered by rain from the sky, a land that the Lord your God looks after. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And if you will only heed his every commandment that I am commanding you today, loving the Lord your God and serving him with all your heart, mind, and soul, then he will give you the rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the later rain. So it seems that God very intentionally promises a land that itself is dependent upon him for sustenance. These famines, these droughts, in a sense, are part of God's domain and his control. This famine did not happen by accident. And when this famine happened, there was a natural tendency to leave this place, to go where you can easily get the resources that you need. But God says no. The furthest you can go is this place that you're currently in, which is Gerar, which is closer towards Egypt, but it's still definitely in this arid landscape of the promised land, because it's in the promised land that you will have to rely on me. It's in the promised land that you will know that I am the one who brings the rain. I will bring the early rain, and it's going to be me who brings the later rain. And that rain is the one that causes the crops to grow, which feeds the herds, which feeds the people. So it all depends on God. Faith is used when it's tested. When you're not being tested, when you have everything you need, you don't really need to trust God. If I have enough food in my fridge, I don't need to trust God that I will have food tomorrow, because I can see that when I open the fridge that it's there. But when there's no food in the fridge, when there's no money in the bank account, that's when humans will have to struggle with what they believe in. God did not want Isaac to go to a place where he would not have to exercise his faith. And instead, this famine is crafted, it seems, as an intentional experience. And just like Abraham's faith was tested, now here Isaac's faith is going to be tested. Isaac's faith is seen in how he responds. He was just promised by God that I will be with you, stay in this land, and I will bless you. And the very next thing that happens is Isaac saying, oh, by the way, just so that I don't die, let's tell everybody that you're my sister, which is the same exact mistake that his father made. And so like father, like son, he makes this idea, or he believes that the fear that he has in front of him is more powerful than the trust that he ought to have in God. This is quite unfortunate. And if you read carefully, they then live in this place for a long period of time. During this long period of time, we do not see him growing. We instead see that it's just a period of stagnation, until the point in time where you get this curious line where the king Abimelech, and by the way, King Abimelech is not the same King Abimelech that we find in the Genesis stories where Abraham goes and meets a king with the same name. Abimelech, most scholars will say it's like a title similar to Pharaoh, or in the New Testament to Herod, which was a common name used within a particular dynasty. So this is probably the generation or two after that first Abimelech that we ran across. So anyways, this current king looks out his window and sees Isaac with Rebekah in a way that indicates to him that they are obviously husband and wife. So the wording the translation that I used was, he showed signs of endearment to his wife. That's to put it politely, to put it mildly. Although some translations do translate it in a more blunt sense, showing a kind of relationship that a husband and a wife only ought to show one another. The actual root word that's being used there is a play on Isaac's own name. It's actually the same word that's used way back earlier in Genesis when Sarah saw that the son of Hagar was playing with her son. And so it can mean a wide variety of things. I think what's important here is the fact that it's a play on the word Isaac. Isaac in Hebrew is Yitzhak, and the word here of what he's doing to his wife is called metzchak. And so it's very similar word, the root words are the same. Basically, if you want to put it in a narrative format, Isaac was being himself. He was just acting as he normally acts. And so it's at this point in time when he is not trying to be something other than he is, and he is just himself, because a husband relating to a wife in the way that a husband ought to relate to a wife, there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. And so once he starts acting like he is the husband of Rebecca, that's when the ruse is exposed. And that's when the king realizes that, oh, you're in fact married. At this point, you can go back and read it yourself. There's a back and forth, and the king was very upset because had this ruse continued, someone would have done something terribly wrong and would have brought guilt upon themselves. So they send him out. It's at this point, it's at this moment, you realize that now Isaac gets blessed. Once he is exposed for who he is, once he tries not to hide who he is in this world that he's living in, now he is ready to be blessed because he is a herder, and now he puts his hand to agriculture, and the Lord blesses him. It's very clearly stated that way, and he produces 100-fold. It's interesting how during times of famine, we will try to be something different than who we really are. We will try to cover our apparent weaknesses and go to a place that we think is going to be better for us. All the while, God is saying, be yourself so that I can show you that I can bless you, even in the midst of this arid place that you are residing in. And this is actually exactly what happens in the life of Isaac. It continues on that he is so blessed that the people start to envy him, and he moves further away. And as he moves further away, he does not quarrel with the people, does not fight with them, he just moves. He goes to a new place, digs a well, gets water, thank God. And then there's a fight over that, and he leaves it. And then he goes and digs another well, and there's a fight over that, and he leaves it. Finally, the third time, he digs a new well, and no one messes with him. And this is a very different attitude than what Abraham had. Abraham was quite more confrontational. Once this happened, once he directly confronted the people of the land and said, listen, this is my water that I am digging, and let's make an oath and let's make a deal and let's not do this anymore, or else. You kind of get that feeling. But you don't get that with Isaac. He almost has this, okay, fine, and then he just lets it happen. Now, we might look at it as a sign of weakness, but when you read it in the context of the character of the story, you get a person who is very bold enough to say to a king and lie to him and say, this is my sister, to now a person who is saying, so be it, so be it, so be it. And each time he says, so be it, he's not being weak. Instead, he's being strong because he relies on God to provide for him each time. And God does each time. So that even in the midst of the famine, he is being blessed more when he lets go of his pride and arrogance and his way of doing things and enables God to provide for him that early water and that late water. When we read further on, by the time we get to the verses surrounding 25, this is where, or at least 23, you see that he builds an altar in that place where Abraham once was. So it's almost like he went through his own kind of testing experience. He did not have to sacrifice his son, but it was a much more grueling and long-term experience of his. I can't help but wonder if the experience that we're going through might in some way relate to this. There might be quick fixes that we can imagine that would get us out of this famine-like experience much faster. There are things that we can say and do that might not accurately reflect the reality of what God has established. And when we do such things, we are limiting the possibilities for God to actually bless us and make us fruitful. It's quite ironic, isn't it? The difference that trusting in God makes. Because on one hand, If you don't trust God, if you say what needs to be said to a people who will buy your story, then you can secure for yourself safety. You can have for yourself space and the possibility of abundance. But in the end, all it leads to is bitterness and contention and fights with those people. Or there's another way, which is to trust God, which means that you stay in the midst of the famine, which means that you have to endure the hardships of digging the well that was already dug, not once, not twice, 3 times, and even the 4th time. It means that it looks like you're not getting anywhere, but in the end, there is abundance. And not only abundance, there's peace. The rest of the passage, if you go on and read it in verse 26 onwards, you see now how the people of that area of Gerar, King Abimelech, comes out to him and makes peace with him. This is, I think, the interesting, counterintuitive, useful function of famines in our lives that God is leading us through. And it takes several times for us to get this right. And perhaps that's why this is in the Bible 3 times. 3 is one of those, when you say something 3 times, you don't need to say it any more than that. That's the kind of connotation that it has. Because if you haven't understood it after the 3rd time, then the 4th time won't make any difference. So by the 3rd time at least, may we, like Isaac, understand that when God has called us to be in a place, that he is going to provide, that he will make a way. And this is not a prosperity gospel that we're speaking of. This is a gospel of God's presence with us, which is the only good news that we know about. But when you do that, there is a result that is more long-lasting and more beneficial for the entire community that can result from it. So may the good Lord strengthen us to embrace the challenges of living in a time of famine, of not running away from it, but enabling God to give us what we need. Let's call it our daily bread. May the good Lord bless us and guide us. Amen.